Ladies and gentlemen, in the audience, Astrid Kander, professor, volunteered to give a presentation together with her colleague Magnus Jiborn, and they will talk about can a new climate calculation actually be able to save the climate in a different manner, or add to the solution at least. Please give them a warm hand to stepping up like this. And Astrid and Magnus will talk for roughly 20 minutes, and by then I think we will have Stefan Nyström here en route from Eslöv.
Okay, so yeah, we will talk together, but Magnus will start. So.
But I will not. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't know. Well, it's a presentation that I held in Umeå a couple of weeks ago that we have adjusted a little bit for this audience. And it's mainly focused on Swedish carbon emissions. And the title is Decoupling or Displacement, Interpreting Swedish Carbon Emission Trends. And this is part of an ongoing project that involves more researchers than Astrid and me. It also involves two colleagues at our department here in Lund, Viktor Askulianis and Hanna Nilsson, and also Daniel Moran, who is at the NTNU in Trondheim. And it also involves Thomas Widman, who is at University of New South Wales in Sydney. And we have a publication that you could, if you write it down, search for at the internet, where some ideas were published before. Well, the starting point is that there is a success story to be told about the Swedish emission trends, and that the government is proud to present, namely that Sweden has accomplished a decoupling of carbon emissions from economic growth. If we see at this is taken from a blog post that is Magdalena Andersson, the Minister of Finance, and Isabella Lövin, the Minister of Development collaboration, published at the World Bank. And it shows that since 1990, the Swedish greenhouse gas emissions have decreased by 23%, and at the same time the GDP has grown by 58%. And that is something new, that you can have economic growth without having increasing carbon emissions, with having actually decreasing carbon emissions. And if this success story is true, then that proves, as the government says, that it is possible to have economic development without having increasing environmental problems. So the question is then, is this success story true or not? And there is a more gloomy version of the story to be told, and this is in Swedish, a couple of debate articles written by Swedish some researchers and some environmental organizations. And what they basically say is that the real climate impact of Sweden is much larger than what those figures presented by the government indicate. Because when the official figures, the official accounts of Swedish emissions include only those emissions that take place within the Swedish territory, what comes out from the chimneys, so to speak. But we also import a lot of stuff, and the import has been growing, and they claim that we import more and more of the dirty stuff from countries like China. And therefore, if you calculate the consumption-based emissions, the emissions that are caused abroad by things that are imported and consumed in Sweden, then the emissions are much larger, and the trend is no longer decreasing but increasing. Consumption-based accounting is then offered as an alternative to the traditional way of counting emissions, the territorial way. And this picture tries to explain how you do it. You start from the territorial emissions, the emissions that occur within the territory, and then you add all emissions that have occurred in other countries in the production of goods that are imported and then you subtract the emissions that occurred in Sweden in the production of goods that we exported. And then you arrive at the consumption-based carbon accounts. And that is much higher. It's almost twice as high, according to some estimates. And according to others, it's about 50% higher. So it's a large difference, and the trend is not decreasing. This is a calculation based on a global database over international trade called the World Input-Output Database that we have done, and it shows that there is a big gap between consumption-based and territorial emissions. And the question is then, what explains this gap? The environmental organizations claim that this is an effect of what they call displacement, that the observed reduction that the Swedish government takes pride in, that is not evidence of decoupling at all, but it results from outsourcing dirty production to other countries. And that is not something to be very proud of, is it? Such outsourcing need not be caused by entire industries closing down and moving the whole production abroad, but it's simply either it's caused by trade deficit, but that's not true for Sweden because we have actually a positive trade balance, or it could be caused by specialization. That's Sweden. The Swedish economy is changing towards less carbon-intensive production, more and more services and more computer-based production of services, whereas we import more and more of the dirty stuff. So the question is this the true picture? Then it's not very good. But there is also an alternative explanation, and that is that this gap between consumption-based and territorial emissions, it does not prove displacement, but it's simply an effect of that Sweden has a more carbon-efficient energy system in general, and that we have a more energy-efficient production than other countries in almost all sectors. And if that is true, then trade as such will tend to increase consumption-based emissions, even if there is no specialization in less carbon-intensive production. And a simple example to explain this, and then I will leave the word to Astrid. Suppose we have considered two imagined countries, call them country A and country B, and suppose that they are identical in all aspects, except that one of the countries, country A, produces all its electricity by wind and hydropower, that is totally carbon-free electricity, whereas country B produces all its electricity by burning coal, so it's very carbon intensive. And they have exactly the same structure in their economy in all other aspects. And suppose now that they trade in a very special way, that they exchange identical goods. So if country A ships 1 ton of steel to country B, then country B ships 1 ton of steel to country A. And if country A ships 1 ton of paper to country B, then country B ships 1 ton of paper to country A. You could think of why do they do that? But suppose that they do it, what will happen? Well, then it will appear as if the emissions in country A increased, whereas the emissions in country B decreased. And nothing really happened. They both have exactly the same consumption as before. They both produce exactly the same, and the global emissions did not change. So how come country A's emissions suddenly seems to have increased? And one possibility is that what we see in the consumption-based accounts of Sweden is actually the effect of this kind of trade, that we trade goods that are produced with more carbon-efficient technology than. So we should test this, and we have done that by a kind of decomposition analysis, where we have decomposed it in 4 different components.
Yes, and here you see the result. So you see that what has what explains the big gap, why the consumption-based was so much higher than the territorial emissions, is basically because the imports has a very high structure of much more carbon to energy, and also that energy to GDP is higher in the imports than in the Swedish economy. It's not due to a trade deficit, because we have a trade surplus, and it's not due to specialization. Specialization here is negative. It's not that Sweden is specializing on exporting these low energy demanding goods. We are actually specializing in heavy industrial production, like still a lot of paper and pulp, a lot of steel exports from Sweden. So it's not a matter of specialization. So the whole idea of the outsourcing idea is not the one that explains it. It's much more to do with Sweden having another energy system that is more carbon efficient and more energy efficiency than abroad. So the preliminary conclusions here is that the displacement hypothesis is not very much supported by the analysis. And secondly, to really understand the effects of foreign trade on global emissions, that requires further analysis. And we need to ask 3 questions. How does foreign trade affect domestic emissions? And how does import affect emissions in other countries? And also, how does Swedish export affect emissions in other countries? The last question is not very often asked, but we think that is necessary to also ask that question. We think that in order to follow up on goals that we set up for our emission reductions in a country, we need to take trade into account, and we need to do it in a good way. So 3 conditions that carbon accounting should satisfy. One thing is very practical thing, that countries should be accountable for emissions that they can affect. You cannot very much affect what kind of energy systems they have abroad, but you can very much affect what energy system you have in your own country by political choices and so on.
And you can also affect the domestic consumption, but it's not very easy to affect for Sweden to change the domestic consumption in China or the US.
Yeah. And the second thing, which seems like very intuitively rational, right, is that activities that lead to reduced global emissions should not be punished by leading to higher national emissions, and vice versa. It should be that if you do something that is good for the climate in your country, it should be seen in your figures. But if you do something bad for the global climate, that should also be seen in your national figures.
Should we give an example? Sorry,
Yeah.
we haven't really. We could perhaps give an example of how you could do something that is bad for the climate and get credit. Well, suppose you have some industries that are better than world average, but still emit some carbon emissions, and then you could reduce your own territorial emissions by simply closing down that industry. Well, if the production moves to some other place where the same goods are produced with much higher carbon intensity, then global emissions will increase by this strategy, but it will look as if you have improved. And that is actually what the environmental organizations have claimed, that is how the Swedish emission reductions have been accomplished. So we should avoid the possibility of outsourcing emissions in that way.
Yes. And the third thing is, it's a matter of having a rational system as well, that the sum of all countries' emissions, when you add them up, they should sum to the global emissions. That's quite straightforward. Okay, so the current two measures that are available, the consumption-based and the production-based accounts, they do not completely satisfy these criteria. So we have proposed a different measure that is like an improvement of the carbon footprint, you can say, and it's a technology-adjusted carbon footprints. They are calculated. You see here to the left, you see what we showed you before, the consumption-based account for Sweden, how that is calculated. To the right, you see how we propose instead that you should calculate this. And we propose in the article in Nature Climate Change that a better method is to count export always by world average technology for all product groups, for all countries. And if we do that for Sweden, we see that we get a much lower technology-adjusted carbon footprint. And why would you do that then? Maybe you would like to say something.
Well, the motivation for this move. Well, we start from exactly the same territorial emissions, and we add in exactly the same way the emissions that are caused by Swedish imports. But then we subtract not the real emissions that were caused in Sweden by Swedish export, but emissions that would have been caused if the same product would have been produced somewhere else. And the motivation for this move is that to reflect the effects of a country's export, then we must consider not only how a good what's actually produced, but also what is the alternative production that it replaces. And the assumption that we make is that a similar good would have been produced. We don't know who would have produced. If a ton of steel was not marketed by one country, who would have produced it instead? We don't know that. But a simple and natural assumption is that it would have been produced by the world market. So let's assume that we have the world market average technology. And that is what we then suggest that one should subtract.
And the positive thing about this is that you cannot hand over the responsibility for technologies in your export sectors to the receiving country. Like China cannot say, okay, we produced a lot of goods for the developed world, and we do it with dirty technology, but we don't care about that because that's your responsibility. So China can deduct, they can take credit for being big exporters, but they cannot take credit also of their dirty technology. They can only deduct world average technology for their goods, and they must resume or keep the responsibility for the difference, for the dirtiness, so to speak.
So the implications is that countries are fully responsible for all their consumption, the amount of consumption, the composition of consumption, and also from where they buy it. But they also held fully responsible for their energy system and production technologies, and that goes for both the export sectors and for domestic production. And that countries are not punished if they do something that reduces global emissions, and they're not rewarded by doing something. You cannot improve your own figures by outsourcing emissions with this method. So it satisfies the three conditions that we put up better than both traditional territorial and consumption-based accounting.
Yeah, and the results then for Sweden is that actually with this technology adjustment of the exports, we find a very different graph for Sweden. It's the orange graph here, technology-based consumption-based account and technology-adjusted consumption-based account. And you see that even though it's lower than both territorial and consumption-based account, it's still not declining in this period. And that is something to draw attention to. The average per capita emissions is roughly 5 tons per person and year, while the territorial emissions are 6 tons. But this is not good enough. As Marco said before, we need to come down to zero emissions. So, we are very far from that with this emission as well, and we don't see an improving trend. So, in that respect, we think that it's correct that the critique that the environmental organizations have towards what the government say, that we are improving a lot our emissions, we are declining them and so on. With this account, we are not declining them, and we need to move really fast. We need to decline them, and that's not happening. We also...
Excuse me, just 1 minute.
Yeah.
Looking at the clock,
Yeah.
could you just take a few minutes to
Yeah, we
round
have
off?
only 2 more.
Terrific,
Yeah.
because I'm looking at the gentleman in front and
Yeah.
looking at the watch,
Yeah,
and
sure.
we'll try to just... Thank you. Perfect.
Yeah, we don't need to go through the results for important regions in the world, but they change quite a lot with this method as well. The relevance for the Swedish climate targets, we have thought about this, okay? Now we propose a new method here. Is this something we should go to Paris with? No, we don't think so. It's not a good idea to come there and confuse everybody and say, oh, we should measure things in a different way. But knowing this, how optimally things should be measured, it will take quite a long while to convince everybody in the scientific community about this. It will take even longer to produce really consistent data sets that cover all world and it's really detailed enough and so on. So we cannot wait for that. But we think that what should be done is that we should set the targets according to the production-based account. We should specify very strong targets, like Miljömålsberedningen are considering doing now. We should really proceed with that, but we should also check. We should use the imports, the negative things that are related to Swedish imports should be related to the positive things that are caused by Swedish exports, and we should see how do these two balance, imports and exports, and we should formulate a goal that we should always do more climate good with our exports than we do climate bad with our imports. That should be an additional goal. That is going to mean that we have to really move, we have to make things, and we are not going to throw out Swedish heavy industry from Sweden and replace it with production in China or anywhere else, which could be the result if we just focus on the production-based account. Thank you. Do you want to say something more?
No.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for doing this on such very short notice. Thank you, Magnus. Thank you, Astrid. Before you take it off, I took it off already, and then Magnus will have to answer. Let's take one question to Magnus and Astrid up front from the audience, and then we'll invite all the panel members up here on stage for one panel that will be joined together. Do we have any questions for Astrid and Magnus? All right. Well, then, thank you very much. There's one question. Excellent. Let's have a microphone. Microphone. And the reason the microphones and the chairs are not in operation is that there's another event in the back and might be interference, so that's why.
Okay, thank you. I've seen this work quite a lot been cited, and especially by the Swedish Federation of Enterprise Federation. Do you see a risk they see this as a perfect excuse of not going to zero, but say that, we export so much very good stuff, so we only need minus 60% or something else like that?
Actually, the suggestion of how to use it is addresses that worry that has been raised several times, and that we also see that it's possible that it can be used in that way. But what we suggest is not that we should formulate national goals only in terms of this measure, but that the central measure should be, as it is, the territorial emissions, and we should formulate sharp goals for emission reductions in territorial, according to the territorial perspective. That means that we must reduce emissions at home. But then we should also have this additional, check. We must check so that we don't achieve those reductions in territorial emissions by outsourcing emissions somewhere else. So in that way, it is not it is, someone said that, well, we don't have to do anything. We can just increase our export and we will achieve all our goals. But that is not possible, because the main goal is to reduce territorial emissions. And we must check that we keep a positive trade balance in carbon emissions while doing that.
Thank you. What is the next step for your research now?
We are trying to decompose further the Swedish emission trends to see from what sectors, how the development in carbon intensity in different sectors are in relation to other countries, and how does the consumption change and so on. So that we shall see in different components how they change.
Yeah, and we also have an interesting collaboration with a professor in Oregon where we will try to set up an optimization model where we can see what should countries specialize in on the global trade market, so to speak, to produce the least global emissions.
Yes, can I just comment on that? Marcus said that we need to do a lot of different things. We need to improve technology, we need to change our behavior, and we need to do all that in order to, because the challenge is very large. But one thing that you don't very often consider is that trade can be an instrument to allocate production resources as efficiently as possible. That is how trade works in other areas, and actually emissions it's a production cost, although it's not internalized in production. So you could use trade in order to allocate production resources in the most carbon efficient way as possible. And as Marcus said, we should use all available instruments to achieve the reductions that are needed. So this project will be a step in that direction to see how it can be.
Well, thank you very much again. We need to do all we can in all the different steps and directions. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now, since there is no Stefan Nyström in the room yet, we will ask the gentlemen from the panel to step up. All of you, please. We have Roger Hildingsson, Political Science, Lund University. He will be now coming up after Marco Rummenkainen. And then we have Fredrik Andersson. And also we have, who's already spoken, Max Åhman, Environmental and Energy Systems Studies, Faculty of Engineering, LTH. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. We intended to have two different panels with two different topics. Now we have to sort of blend everything together and do our best to shed some light on this big topic. How do we reach zero climate gas emissions? Let's see. I have to blend my cards a bit here. Marco, you spoke of bottoms up as a means of reaching something that we might not be able to achieve in Paris. Gentlemen, from your perspective, you come from political science, you're from the technical sector of the university. What is your take on that aspect of how to approach the challenges? That we do not only need to look at the big institutions, the national states, but also smaller entities like, for instance, universities or cities. How does that ring to you? Max, would you like to start?
Well, thank you. Well, well, it's kind of back to reality, doing the bottom-up approach instead, where you focus on actually getting things done, and then as we go along and learn, we might sharpen the targets. I mean, the Kyoto Protocol was designed from an idea of sort of perfect rationality. We should just allocate emission reduction budgets to all countries and we'll agree, and then we'll do our stuff at home. But in reality, it doesn't work like that way. I mean, there's a lot of conflicts that need to be resolved. So from my perspective, I mean, it's more focus on actually getting things done. So in that way, it's good. It will not be enough, but it's a good start.
Thank you. Fredrik Andersson.
Well, I agree with Max, and I think it's important to remember that we can't sort of engineer things from the top. Change comes from below. Well, it comes from changes from consumers, individual firms change technology, and so on. So I think there's a lot of things we can do locally, a lot of good examples we can set, which other ones can follow. And then at the end, we might need sort of some form of global harmonization. But if we have all these good local examples to follow, it will be much easier, I think. So, and if you look historically, all change comes from the bottom. It doesn't come from the top. And sometimes I think we use it as an excuse that we don't have a global carbon price, for example, for not doing things, and that worries me a little bit.
Thank you, Fredrik. Torger?
Thank you. I also agree with what you have said, both Max and Fredrik, and previously Marco, about this. But I think we could also, it's definitely sort of a reality check. We're back to reality, as you say, Max. But we could also turn that into the shift that we have seen in climate politics as an opportunity. We could think about that we have left sort of the old version of climate politics, where we try to globally regulate from this kind of perfect rationality that Max mentions, and now we're rather in a new era of climate politics, which could be, if done in a clever way, could provide a lot of opportunities for addressing, as Thomas mentioned, for instance, the broader challenges. That's how do we get these kind of transformative changes to actually happen? How do we get actors up on the board? Because, and then we have to sort of think through what is the relationship of the international climate regime here. Well, the most important then with the new climate agreement is not maybe that we get a new binding agreement, but that we get as many parties on board as possible. And then we have to sort of work us from there and continuously. And then maybe these kind of issues that we think are more procedural, like what we negotiate about MRV issues, for instance. How are we about to report what we actually are doing to deliver on the pledges or the INDCs that we promise? Then these kind of issues then becomes extremely important. The negotiations about different kind of mechanisms like finance, how are they going to operate? These kind of negotiations becomes more important than what is the specific target. Because when we're trying to get all these states together, we will never reach what is sort of optimal or perfectly rational. But we have to get sort of the process going. That's more.
Thank you, Roger. Marco, would you like to add? You briefly touched on this topic already with the bottom up.
In a way, I think it always has been there, but we have not looked at it from that angle some years ago before Copenhagen, and so that of course there always is the implementation and the national policy making and decisions that somehow are connected to the international one. But I guess the big question is that where does the change happen? That where is it decided that what can happen? Is it the bottom up or does it top down help? There is one thing in international negotiations, and that is this creation of institutions and enabling things and so on that some countries are very dependent on. Because there are some of these INDCs that are conditional. Country X says that we will do this provided that. And there we have the international aspect again, which can be done to multilateral regime or could also be done between two countries, for example. But there still is this conditionality that we will work on our emissions in this way, provided that we are provided with support or that there are equal or comparable responses from other countries. So the international regime still has a role to play, but it certainly is not the only, how do you say it, the only game in town? Yes.
Thank you very much. The Swedish climate policy was the topic, the main topic today, to talk about how do we move it forward. Would you like to just, in the same order as before, but let's start with Max. How do we best twist and tweak this Swedish climate policy in order to go as far ahead as possible? It's a big question, I know.
Yeah, I have to be quite positive. I think most of the things are already in place. I mean, we do have technology. We certainly can afford it. I mean, interest rates are on a record low. So, I mean, there's no problem in financing it if we want to. And we do have ambitions and plans. perhaps we need to sharpen them a little bit, and I think that's probably what Stefan would have said that they're actually discussing right now, how to do the long-term planning, because it's unique to have a target that's sort of 40 years ahead of time, and we have to plan and somehow to actually manage a target 40 years ahead of time. Most political processes are used to 5 or 10 years ahead of time normally. So I think it's about learning, but we have done so far, we've done so good, but now it starts getting more difficult because the low-hanging fruits are no longer there. They keep growing up again, but there's still a lot of high-hanging fruits that we need to pick as well.
Thank you. Fredrik?
Well, I would be not as optimistic as Max, probably because, yes, we have a lot of technology. We can see a lot of solutions how we could sort of transform society into a fossil-free economy, but we have to use it. And some of technology is at very, very early stages. We need to be developed, we need to develop infrastructure around it, we need to develop institutions around it, we might need to change the tax system, and so on and so on and so on. And all of that will have to come in place as well. And we're not going to, sometimes I get the impression when we discuss these issues, we think about the world as business as usual. And then we have a little bit of climate policies to sort of save us from rising temperatures. And I don't think it's that simple. For me, it's much more a development issue. We're going to develop society until 2050, and that will involve a lot of changes because we built society around fossil fuels since the first industrial revolution, and we haven't moved away from that, and we can discuss different ways of measuring, but still, it shows that we are dependent upon fossil fuels, and without them we wouldn't have the same level of material welfare. So to get the real transition, we need a lot of different changes, and they have to come in the right order, and it all have to fit together. So, so it's not just a carbon tax; it's much broader than that. And I'm not that optimistic that we really grasp that yet, and have plans or institutions that are ready for that.
Well, great that you don't agree with each other in the panel. So the one implication of what I said before, that we are sort of in a new era, or if we think about climate politics as something different than we used to think about it. What then come in the old way of thinking of climate politics, we agreed something internationally, and you talked about it, and that meant that we had to implement something nationally. Then we came to questions about what is the most effective way of implementing these ambitions. What is the most, and then we come to the cost calculation. What is the most cost-effective way of doing this? And that has been characterizing climate politics for over 15 years. I have even called it waste of time for climate politics. And I would say the opportunity now is that if we don't expect these kind of global ambitions, targets coming out of the international level, but they have to emanate from somewhere else, then there is an opportunity to focus on and not be so worried about what is the most cost-effective policy option here. Because when we come to Swedish politics, Swedish climate politics, we have seen, and I'm very critical about what we have seen in the latest 10 years, where we have been so concerned about what is the most optimal, the most cost-effective climate policy, while we're in a situation where we understand that we have to sort of a broad palette of policies and measures, which is much tougher to count sort of what is the optimal policy mix to work with here. So.
Thank you. Mark, I'd like to ask you specifically, are we top-notch, I mean, internationally in our climate work, or are we just sort of in the top tier?
Well, my impression is that Sweden is certainly one of the better ones, and maybe even one of the best ones for various reasons, given that there is a tradition of thinking about these things and working on these things, given that there has been measures taken, which maybe were some of the low-hanging fruits, but measures taken anyway, which has contributed to a positive development without increasing the emissions, rather the opposite. And Sweden is also active on the international arena in not only the climate question, but also other questions, trying to voice and rally support to sustainable development, climate, and so on and so on. So among the better ones, or among the best ones, even. But if I also may say that about the Swedish context. So what is important, and I guess the important is to have, I think, what is important is to have this long-term view, long-term pathway somehow set up. I mean, we need to know where we want to be in 20, 30, 50, 100 years' time when we take decisions today. I mean, decision today is the starting point for the decision tomorrow, and then you can roll this forward to 2100 or so. And that's why these long-term pathways, long-term targets, as long as they in the view of sort of short-term targets, are important. And perhaps when Stefan gets here, if he gets here, he will talk about the climate policy framework. So like in the UK, it's a climate law which has its pluses and minuses and so on. But how do we put into thinking how we go from here to there? Just sort of halting comparison if you talk about the low-hanging fruits. Yes, we should pick them, certainly. But we shouldn't pick them with the branches, because then we can't reach the high-hanging fruits anymore. Which means that the decisions which we can do today should be along the pathway in the direction that enable the next step to be taken, rather than, well, finding the next tree or so, whatever it now might entail.
Thank you. Let's talk about incentives. In tradition, would you say that in Sweden we've been working more with whips than with carrots? And what is the best way forward, incentive-wise? Do we need to use the whip or the carrot?
Both, I would say. Yeah.
That's
would be the reasonable answer. And just to say, my question to Stefan or Anders Wikman, if they have been here, is how are we thinking about this new sort of climate policy framework, which are intended to be there and trying to bring together? How could we support these kind of medium-term, long-term transformations that are needed to sort of approach these climate ambitions? And to do that, it's different from different parts of society, different parts of sectors that is needed. And in some sectors, things have sort of gone on very well, while we are just starting in other sectors. For instance, compare, for instance, electricity and heating with transport sector, for instance, where they are not on pace with each other. Thomas had some suggestions a couple of years ago, and we still don't know what's happening with them. So.
Thank you. You wanted to add, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it's not black and white because, I mean, I was going to say that one person's whip is another person's carrot, but I'm not sure if that is a good way of framing it. But if you think about sort of, what's it now, green tax change or so, that, okay, you have to pay more, but you get the money. So it's not so that the change as such needs to be difficult or frightening or anything like that, but the change that is different for different people, because some people will gain compared to what they had before, and some people will have to do something else, which may be a negative aspect. But the overall effect doesn't have to be a whip or a carrot.
Speaking of whips, just 1 second, Frederick. How close are we to the meat tax in regards to the latest news on meat and cancer? Are we coming closer to the meat tax? What do you think? Any reflections?
Yeah, personally, I wouldn't think so.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think it's so. And it will sort of begin to talk about people's choices here, and I think that will hit sort of our view of freedom, and I don't think we would accept that, actually.
Well, every time the question is brought on the table by journalists to the government, it's always sort of, avoided. But it does.
It's also, if you're going to have a policy, it has to be accepted, and the policy might be accepted in 10, 15 years' time if you begin to move in that direction. But to come down and say now we're going to have a meat tax, you will get more than half the population will vote against you. You've prepared people for it over a longer period of time. If you begin to change norms and so on, then you might have it. And that comes to what I want to say about sort of the carrot and the whip, that we have to think a little bit carefully here and a little bit more intelligently when you think about policies. Because yes, you can whip people and you can punish people, but there should be an alternative. Right? If you come in and you tell a family living in the suburbs that now we're going to have a high price on gasoline, it's going to be 30 crowns per liter, they're going to revolt because they need a car and they have no alternative. if you sort of have another energy source, if we remove the need to have a car as much or drive as much as we need today, then it might be easier to sort of increase the price and whip those who still use the car. But you sort of have to think, first we have to enable a change, and then we can begin to whip people a little bit more when they have a change, an alternative to what we do today.
Some would say we're past that.
Well, you can't be past that, because let's take the example with what Marcus was talking about. You have a tax, but you get the money back. Australia introduced a carbon tax, and they cut other taxes as well, so you were compensated for it. But the carbon tax only survived 2 years. Then it was abolished. Why? It was abolished because it became, sort of in political language, the giant tax on everything. Because there will be some form of carbon in most production, even in services. So that increased prices, and people saw that and didn't care about the compensation they got. So after 2 years, we asked the Australian people, should we cut emissions in Australia? And 86% said yes. Then they asked, should we abolish the carbon tax? And 49% said yes. We don't want to pay it, right? So if you haven't prepared it in a democratic system, you will get the backlash. And then you go back, and I doubt if so the Green government in Australia could introduce a tax now, given where they are. So you have to prepare it a little bit better. Otherwise, it just set us back maybe decades.
Well, that's a good point. Talk about challenges. Which are our biggest challenges in Sweden in terms of climate policy work? Is it the transportation sector, Roger, that we really have to work harder on?
Yeah, or maybe what we heard from Astrid and Magnus earlier, the sort of how we deal with the consumption is also, of course, challenging. And that also ties, because that ties, when it comes to transports and consumption, that ties maybe, it's easier to change sort of energy systems or technical systems, it's challenging that also, I would say, but maybe it's even more challenging to sort of things that sort of stuck into the very core of our sort of way of life and lifestyles and things, and tying to what Fredrik said, then we have to sort of think through how do we change these kind of structures that sort of affect our way of life, and that's more complicated. It's more complex, and we need a broad set of initiatives and measures there.
There are movements that want to take much further steps, like the transition movement, etc., that really think we're moving too slowly in terms of transportation solutions, etc., and just lifestyle issues. What is your reflections on movements that really want to sort of take more quantum leaps in terms of change of lifestyle, etc.?
Well, anyone who wants to take a giant leap are welcome to do it. The question is, what do people on average do, and how can we get people on average to care or be willing to take the necessary steps? And then I think you will have to, as we talked before, talk about benefits and have a positive vision of what we're trying to achieve to 2050. And one thing which worries me quite a lot is that we always have a sort of disaster discussion. The narrative is always disaster. And then I think a lot of people tune out and don't think about it. And you can walk around in Lund and not care about the climate because you don't see anything happening about the climate. Everything is nice. So you can't sort of tune out of it. I think you'll have to create a positive narrative of why you're doing it, and then the pause is connected to that. But if people want to take steps and show the way, perfect, please do. Maybe we can learn something from it.
Thank you. Marco?
I was talking in an event a couple of weeks ago, and to normal people, about as normal as you. And somebody got an insight, and he said, ja, men det kanske är så att man inte behöver flyga till Thailand. Man kan flyga till Rom istället. And I thought, well, okay, it's an improvement, but there's still something that was lacking from that insight. But this is a positive story, perhaps, that what do we mean? It's a story that nobody will be allowed to fly anymore in 10 years' time. Or will everybody fly in an airplane which is made of resource-efficient, recyclable materials and running on biofuels grown in an environmentally friendly fashion? So which which is a story that we want to sort of go towards. And I mean, if we do one or the other, then we don't need to sort of ask people if they want to fly to Thailand or Rome or somewhere else for that matter.